Leonard Brooks sat in his usual corner booth at Maggie's diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. The comforting aroma of bacon and eggs hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of maple syrup. The diner, with its checkered floors, vinyl seats, and softly jingling bell on the door, felt like a step back in time. Leonard appreciated the stability it offered. At 90 years old, after surviving the chaos of the Korean War and decades of hard-earned peace, he found solace in the small things: a quiet breakfast, familiar faces, and a warm cup of coffee. Another refill, Mr. Brooks? Maggie asked, holding a coffee pot in one hand and brushing her apron with the other. Sure thing, Maggie, Leonard replied with a kind smile. She was young, no older than her late 20s, with tired eyes that spoke of long shifts and endless responsibilities. Busy morning? Always, she said, pouring his coffee, especially since those guys started showing up. Leonard raised a curious eyebrow. What guys? Before Maggie could answer, the rumble of motorcycles filled the parking lot. The sound was sharp and jarring, shaking the windows and silencing the conversations inside. Leonard didn't need to look. He could feel the tension settle over the room. The Steel Riders had arrived. The gang of bikers had rolled into town over the past year, gradually taking over with their loud engines and louder attitudes. They weren't just disruptive, they were dangerous, controlling the streets with intimidation and violence. The door swung open, and 4 men strode in, their leather jackets adorned with patches and their boots heavy against the tiled floor. Tattoos crawled up their necks and arms, chains clinking as they walked. They moved like they owned the place. And perhaps, in their minds, they did. Maggie flinched but quickly looked down, her hands fidgeting with a dish rack. Leonard set his cup down, his posture straightening. The leader of the group, a towering man with a bald head and a jagged scar cutting across his cheek, approached the counter. His name was Tank, a fitting nickname for someone of his size and demeanor. He leaned against the counter, his grin wide and mocking. "Morning, sweetheart," Tank said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why don't you pour me some coffee? And smile while you're at it." Maggie's hands trembled as she reached for a cup. Leonard's jaw tightened. He'd never had much tolerance for bullies. Tank noticed her shaky hands and laughed, the sound low and menacing. "What's wrong, darling? Afraid I might bite?" He leaned closer, inches from her face. "Maybe I should." Leonard cleared his throat loudly, the sound cutting through the tension. The diner fell silent. "Leave the girl alone," Leonard said, his voice steady and firm. Tank turned slowly, his grin fading as he sized up Leonard. The old man's gray hair and frail frame didn't match the defiance in his eyes. Well, Tank said, a smirk creeping back onto his face. "What do we have here?" "Grandpa wants to play hero." Leonard didn't flinch. "I said leave her alone." One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, stepped forward. "You got a death wish, old man?" "I've faced death before," Leonard replied evenly. "You don't scare me." Tank's grin twisted into something colder. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he didn't like it. He stepped closer, towering over Leonard. "You don't know who you're talking to," Tank said. "And you don't know who you're talking to." Leonard shot back, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, it seemed like Tank might back down, but then he laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Without warning, he swung his fist, striking Leonard across the jaw. The old man stumbled back, crashing into the booth behind him. Coffee spilled, plates shattered, and Maggie screamed. Leonard wiped the blood from his lip and stood, his back straight and his voice calm. Still standing, Tank's smile faltered, but before he could strike again, Maggie stepped between them, tears streaming down her face. "Stop," she cried. "Just stop." Tank lowered his fist but leaned in close to Leonard. "Next time, stay in your seat, old man." The bikers turned and left, the bell jingling behind them. Outside, their motorcycles roared to life, and they were gone. Maggie rushed to Leonard's side. "Are you okay?" Leonard nodded, though his jaw throbbed. "I've had worse." But as he sat back down, humiliation burned hotter than the pain. He wasn't angry about taking a punch. He'd been hit before. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his town, and he'd been humiliated in front of its people. He couldn't let it go. Reaching into his pocket, Leonard pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "James," he said, his voice steady. "I need your help." "What happened?" "Dad?" James' voice was sharp with concern. Leonard's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the parking lot outside. They messed with the wrong man. James Brooks arrived within 15 minutes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his police uniform crisp and his badge gleaming under the afternoon sun. At 40, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a seasoned lawman. His jaw tightened when he saw the bruise forming on Leonard's face. "What the hell happened?" James demanded. Stepping into the house, Leonard sank into his recliner and gestured for James to sit. "Bikers," he said simply. "The Steel Riders." James' expression darkened. "The Steel Riders? They're the same gang I've been investigating for months. Drugs, weapons, extortion. They're dangerous." "Dad." Leonard's lips pressed into a thin line. "And they're running free?" "Not for long," James said. "But we need evidence. And the town's too scared to testify." "I'm not scared," Leonard said firmly. James sighed, frustration mingling with pride. "Maybe not, but I need you to let me handle this. Next time, it could be worse." Leonard straightened in his chair. "I've been through worse, son." James placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You don't have to fight this battle, Dad. Let me do it." Leonard studied his son for a long moment. "Promise me one thing," he said finally. "What's that?" "Don't let anger make you reckless." James nodded, though the fire in his eyes suggested it wouldn't be that simple. That evening, James parked his squad car outside the Steel Riders clubhouse, an old auto shop on the outskirts of town. He didn't bring backup. This was personal. Tank and his crew were outside, their motorcycles gleaming under the dim light of a street lamp. When they saw James step out of his car, their laughter died down. "Well, look who it is," Tank said, standing. "You lost, officer." James didn't flinch. "No, but you are. Stay away from my father." Tank smirked, stepping closer. "Or what?" James leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "Or you'll find out." For a brief moment, Tank's confidence wavered, but he recovered quickly, laughing. "Careful, Chief. You might start something you can't finish." James stared him down. "Oh, I always finish what I start." The next morning, Leonard sat on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching the sunrise. His jaw still ached, but the fire inside him burned stronger. The Steel Riders thought they owned the town, but they'd made a grave mistake. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Leonard wasn't just a stubborn old man. He was a survivor, a warrior, and he wasn't backing down. And neither was his son.